This is Justice, History, and the Law. Lectures, discussions, and interviews from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. July 11th, 2005. Professor John Q. Barrett speaks to the Jackson Society about Justice Jackson's time in London before the Nuremberg Trial.
This gentleman really needs no introduction, but he's clearly one of our closest friends of the Robert H. Jackson Center, Professor John Q. Barrett. Professor Barrett was involved with us almost at the same time that we were even contemplating this Jackson Center. He has been, continues to be, the ultimate scholar on Justice Jackson. His book, That Man, is upstairs for those who also would like to acquire a book. So when you buy Jeff Stone's book, John's book is up there as well. He's been with us from the beginning, literally, and he has moderated some of our major events down here, which included the introduction of Chief Justice Rehnquist, the introduction of Fred Korematsu, the introduction of Linda Brown, and the introduction of all of our law clerk events, and has been the principal speaker at least twice at Chautauqua, one off the amphitheater stage 2 years ago. He is the Elizabeth S. Linney Fellow at the Robert Jackson Center. We're honored to call him that. He will be soon leaving here to go to the Truman Library to put on an event, and from there to move to Nuremberg, where he's also participating in an event. His next 10 days is a whirlwind. So we're delighted he paused to participate in today's event with Professor Stone, and also to give us an education. Ed, hopefully the camera's going, because I want to get this on tape. A discourse on the importance of the London Agreement. With that, John Barrett.
Thank you very much, Greg, and friends, and really family in a sense. This place of Jamestown and the Jackson Center has become obviously a center of gravity in my life, a great supportive community. What all of you as members of the Jackson Society make possible is in part my work and so much more than that. And without exaggerating it, what you do is extremely significant, and personally I'm very grateful for that, because I think you've got an audience that's much bigger than you begin to realize. This person, Robert Jackson, this life, this legacy, these accomplishments, this pinnacle person in American history, not the guy, but a handful of people in American history, is something that you are launching as Jackson Society members, as core supporters of the Jackson Center, and I really, on behalf of everybody else who will benefit from that, thank you very sincerely. 60 years ago, Robert Jackson was in London. Actually, on this date of July 11th, my dad's birthday, I did remember to give him a call, Robert Jackson and his son William and a couple of core people who were part of that project went out to a restaurant in London and had a fairly crummy meal because although the piece was 2 months old, the food yet wasn't great and so forth, even for VIPs. And it was a goodbye dinner for a name that some of you may know, his dear secretary Ruth Sternberg, a native of Frewsburg, who had been with him in Washington since 1938, his secretary as Solicitor General, and then as Attorney General, and then at the Supreme Court, and then in Nuremberg, had parents in failing health, and Ruth Sternberg had been committed to return here to this region when Jackson got this new assignment, and she agreed to go with him for the startup phase. So July 11th, 60 years ago, 1945, was Ruth Sternberg's goodbye dinner, and she flew out of London the next day. This souvenir copy you've got of the London Agreement is important, and I do sincerely urge you to read it in the next couple of days when you have a quiet moment. It's really two pieces. It is a London Agreement on top of a charter of the International Military Tribunal. And in an interesting way, when you read it, you'll be among the select group that begins to understand that Nuremberg, a great historical accomplishment, actually in many ways was over and done and happened in London in the summer of 1945. This actual copy, you'll note, is a British copy. Greg was amused when I pointed this out to him. I'll point it out to you too. I'm not sure what his source was, but if you look at the signatories, you'll see the first one, this is on the page number 3, a couple of pages in, is Jowett. Lord Jowett, the British representative, on top of Jackson, on top of Robert Falco, the French representative, on top of Nikitchenko and Trenin, the Soviet representatives. This is a British print. They put the British guy first. If you look in this version, which is the U.S. Department of State version, it's Robert Jackson's Red Book on London, one of the least known and most powerful Jackson books you can find, if you really scour the archives or eBay. You'll find a printed version of this agreement that begins with, guess who? Jackson. And I would suppose somewhere in the Soviet Union there's one that begins with Nikitchenko, and somewhere in France there's one that begins with Falco. This London Agreement is the London Agreement, so it's maybe appropriate that we have a British copy to look at tonight. I want to tell you just a little bit. It's hot, it's been a long day, I don't want to go on too long, but a little bit about what I mean when I say that Nuremberg happened in London. The commitment to prosecute Nazi war criminals was made by President Roosevelt and by his Allied compatriots, Churchill and Stalin, beginning as early as 1942, informally. It was a vague promise and part of diplomatic communiques. It is first formalized in what's called the Moscow Agreement of 1943, which actually the big three personally weren't part of. They never gathered in Moscow, but their foreign ministers and the document traveled through Moscow, and the commitment was made there to prosecute, rather than through other means, dispose of war criminals following the inevitable Allied victory. And by 1943, although you couldn't say the same thing about 1942, by 1943 it was clear that the Allied victory was inevitable. And the victory and the conquering position that the Allies would be in at that moment of unconditional surrender, you may remember, was Franklin Roosevelt's demand and ultimately what they required of the German Reich in 1945. The Allied position then would be absolute power. And the options were really stark and three. At that point in time, one, as the victor, could either release the defeated, the war is done, we hold your turf, we've vanquished your military machine, scatter as you will, or, at the other extreme of the spectrum, to take what's called executive action, to line them up, whoever they are, and conclude the military action by executions. We know who you are, we know what you've done, we have the power, you're gone. Or, in a unique and historically unprecedented way, to find a third path, a path of law. And at this point, I'm going to give you a little tourist tip about the outside of the Jackson Center. You will find out this way, and if you take a right, 3 panels of Masonic symbolism that are etched into the sandstone of the building. And the center of those 3 is the scales of justice. There's a law commitment and a law symbolism in the history of Masonry, which of course was the predecessor of this building. And I call that to your mind because on the cover of this publication, this is the Department of State report on the London negotiations of the summer of 1945, there is an imprint of the scales of justice. You can't see it in this lighting in this copy, but I'll gladly show you this after I'm done speaking. This was the logo, this was the letterhead design of the International Military Tribunal. But it was a bit of a pun. I don't know, I've seen in no Nuremberg book an explanation of who drew this, who invented it, whose fancy this was. But if you look at it for a second, on letterhead or on this book or on anything else, you figure out that it's upside down. Because when you turn it over, it's 2 parachutes. It's billowing scales of justice. It's not a metallic, rounded scale. It's got the scalloping, particularly on the stationery, that shows you it's a parachute. And the letterhead shows it all the clearer with the strings descending from connecting to a parachute bag and a harness. The idea of Nuremberg, down to the level of this symbolism and this letterhead and this embossed thing, was that law was back. Law was parachuting in to the wreckage and the devastation of war. A quintessentially lawless, or, as we come to learn, illegal activity. And that's what happened at London. Literally, the parachute bags were packed. The parachutes that were later pulled and bloomed over Nuremberg, that descended gracefully, peacefully, in a life-preserving way on Nuremberg at London in the summer of 1945. And it's right there on the cover of the book and on the letterhead. That's what Jackson's accomplishment was, among others, but principally his as the American protagonist. For him, it started years earlier. It really started before the war. Robert Jackson's connection to these legality of law issues began back in the days when he was Solicitor General of the United States and Attorney General of the United States, 39, 40, 41. Roosevelt believed, and in a very couched, finessed way, discussed a bit publicly that American involvement was inevitable. And he brought a deeply isolationist country to a point of military preparedness and involvement while seeking an unprecedented third term in 1940. Repeals of neutrality legislations, the destroyer deal with the British in the fall of 1940, the early Lend-Lease legislation in 1941, first for Britain, then for the Soviet Union once Hitler has abrogated the pact with the Soviet Union. And a lot of the legal work on the illegality of the Nazi aggression and the legality of the Roosevelt administration military assistance to what became the Allied cause was on the desk of Robert Jackson. It was the work of Robert Jackson as SG and as AG in that 39, 40, 41 period. He's in the thick of that stuff, and it's really there for the first time that he begins to study deeply the history of war, the international and domestic legal treatment of war, and the history of the disastrous effort to prosecute war criminals following World War I and so forth. And Franklin Roosevelt knows that. After Pearl Harbor, Robert Jackson, some of you may have heard this already from me, for which I apologize. Robert Jackson's on the bench that week of December 7, it's a Sunday, 1941, and the Supreme Court is hearing oral argument in such weighty matters as a case known as Lower Merion Country Club versus United States. It's about the U.S. tax code deductibility treatment of corporation-paid country club dues for corporate officers. And in the conference of the Supreme Court, Robert Jackson, freshman justice, blows a gasket. Good God, the world is at war, and we're doing crap like this. For which Chief Justice Stone assigned him the responsibility of writing the opinion in the Lower Merion case. But separately, and at that time period, Jackson, like many people in the judiciary and people who were Roosevelt intimates, volunteers to leave the court, to come back to service, to rejoin the executive branch, to do what he can for the nation in this cause of war. And at that point in time, 41, spring of 42, Franklin Roosevelt tells him, stay put. Stay put for two reasons. Stay put because I want you on the court and I want you to develop a judicial reputation because I have intentions for you on the court, which was Roosevelt's intention to make Jackson the Chief Justice. And of course, a run and a track record as Associate Justice would set that up. And secondly, I'm not sure this is Roosevelt's phrase, this is Jackson's phrase, you're not much of a warrior. I'm not sure what there is for you to contribute to the fight, but there are things that you will be uniquely suited to do once the fight is won. And what Roosevelt was referring to in those very early moments was a role that he recognized based on his track record with Jackson. Jackson was the lawyer for the toughest case, the most complex fight, the biggest battle, the so-called trial of the century, be it the Andrew Mellon case or the court-packing battle or the constitutionality of Social Security or the National Labor Relations Act or the Public Utilities Holding Company Act, etc., 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 was what Jackson had done and won for Roosevelt in the 30s. And what Roosevelt is seeing and thinking about as early as 42 is that Jackson is the best lawyer in the country and the biggest case that will need the best lawyer in the world after the war is the prosecution of the criminals who have brought this on us. It's really the prosecution of Adolf Hitler that Roosevelt, in an embryonic way, has in his mind as early as the spring and summer of 1942 for Jackson. Jackson, during those terms on the court, is of course doing his court work, but in a striking way, he's also reading a hell of a lot of stuff about international law. He's studying history of war and war crimes and prosecution efforts in a way that no one really recognized, but looking with hindsight, you can see he's getting ready for this assignment. By the fall of 44, as Roosevelt's seeking the fourth term, there's a deep battle in the administration, which Jackson and the judiciary is not part of, about what should be done following the victory. And it's a pitted battle between Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of Treasury, and Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War. And with no insult intended to Morgenthau, a dear Jackson friend and a great figure in American history, those polls might be described as non-legal versus legal, military versus civilian. Because what Morgenthau was advocating was a military reduction of Germany to a permanent pastoral state and executive disposition of the Nazi leadership. In other words, the firing squad. And what Stimson was advocating was the law parachuting in, something like what became Nuremberg, and what Roosevelt already had in his mind, and evidently discussed with Stimson, and what Stimson begins mentioning explicitly in late 44 and early 45 is that Justice Jackson of the Supreme Court is the person to begin to work on these issues. Roosevelt goes to Yalta with a memorandum that's signed by Stimson and Francis Biddle, the Attorney General, and Henry Stettinius, the Secretary of State, committing to a law path, a prosecution of war criminals path. And at Yalta it gets almost no discussion, but it is committed to the foreign ministers for further meetings. And at that point, Samuel Rosenman, Roosevelt's White House counsel and core speechwriter, goes to London and spends the March-April 1945 period negotiating with the British, who were deeply skeptical and were more in the summary action military disposition category, how we could really do this. That is disrupted by Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945. It pulls Rosenman back to the United States. It puts Harry Truman into a job for which he was ill-prepared. It requires people like Stimson to brief him on the Manhattan Project and Rosenman to brief him on the War Criminals Project. And Truman generally turns the key and implements a series of Roosevelt plans. We know a lot more about the Manhattan Project, but give Truman credit and give Roosevelt credit in the background for the law path commitment to what should be done with the Germans following the victory. Rosenman explains this, Truman ratifies it, Rosenman consults with Jackson, Jackson comes to meet with Truman. A lot of back and forth occurs in April 1945, and at the end it emerges publicly on May 2nd with Truman's appointment of Jackson as the United States Chief Counsel for the prosecution of Axis war criminals in the former German Reich. The job description as of that May 1945 moment is 2 P's: preparation and prosecution of cases. As Jackson understands it, he's going to be parachuting into a courtroom to try cases that are ready to go during the summer recess of the Supreme Court, and it will be over and done for him to be back on the bench by the first Monday in October 1945. Now, think about it for a moment. 4 allies, the French is a sort of newly liberated ally, but the Soviets, the British, and the United States are committed to this project in a very general, vague sense. And the only sub-principles negotiation that has occurred has been the Rosenman-British conversations in London during March and April. No Soviets, no cable traffic, just silence. All of that still remains to be done. It's a bill of goods, in a sense, that Jackson signs on for with that May 2nd appointment. He almost immediately learns not only that there's no agreement among the allies about all the nuts and bolts about how you'll do this prosecution, there aren't these mythical cases ready to go. There's very little evidence that's been gathered. There's very little evidence that actually connects to individuals, that demonstrates personal culpability on conduct that can be regarded as criminal, etc. And in short order, the negotiation, the diplomacy of this travels from Washington to San Francisco to the United Nations conference, the preparatory conference, back to Washington, and then gets tossed to Jackson. You know, Mr. 2P's preparation and prosecution. Guess what you need to do first? Get the agreement among the allies about how this is going to happen. And so Jackson, first on a scouting trip before the Supreme Court term is over, and then full-time beginning on June 18th, 1945, goes to London to do one of the most complex diplomatic tasks, certainly of the 20th century, and I would think ever, in international relations. And the beauty of this book, this unknown book, is that it's verbatim transcripts of everything they did in London during that summer of 1945. Jackson's replacement secretary, who he had pulled up from the Supreme Court steno pool to replace Ruth Sternberg, a woman named Elsie Douglas, kept meticulous shorthand notes, and in the years after Nuremberg, transcribed them, and this eventually all got published. Deep in the Cold War, long after anybody was paying much attention to Nuremberg or ready to read this. But if you read it now, what you see is an amazing diplomatic feat. And so for all the greatness of Nuremberg, which is the prosecutor's job, 60 years ago, July, it's nice serendipity that we get to focus on London, a diplomat's job, because Jackson got that too, and he pulled that off. There are a huge number of details and complexities to the London story. Let me summarize it very briefly by telling you how it came out, and then tell you a little bit of the humor along the way. How it came out is that these three, plus the French, but the principal three very different legal systems had to negotiate a common approach. A definition of crimes, a charter of a court, procedure for a court, defense resources for the defendants, burden of proof on the prosecution, a judiciary of true independence. All of that had to be done. And it had to be done in Jackson's view, which you ultimately find reflected in this agreement, in a way that wasn't victor's justice. The Soviets spent the month of July, the representatives in London and then Moscow, which they constantly had to check with, arguing for a Nazi-specific approach. This is what we're going to codify as the approach with which we will deal with these guys who we're going to execute. That was the Soviet mentality. Jackson spent a month, a dogged, deliberate, detailed month, arguing that this was about law. And one of the core defining characteristics of law is that it's universal. If this was really going to be something that existed and could be fairly applied by us to those we defeated, it had to be something that was general. In the famous words he used months later at the trial, this can't be a poisoned chalice. If we put it to their lips, we put it to our own lips as well. And it took a month of incredible sessions to bring the Soviet Union around to that position. In other words, this wasn't making special rules for the Nazis. This was making general rules for the Nazis and the Soviets and the Americans and the British and the French and the human race. And that's what's reflected in the London Agreement and the Charter. They also had to define crimes from their disparate legal systems. And what they define, in a sense, for the first time on paper, but in Jackson's view, and I think in the better view among Nuremberg analysts, in a timeless way, memorializing things that had already existed, was these universal crimes. The crime of waging aggressive war, of being the attacker, the predator, the would-be conqueror. The crimes of committing war in the fighting of war. The slaughtering and torturing and etc. of the opposing army. In other words, playing not by the rules in the conduct of war. And the crimes of, for the first time in codified form, crimes against humanity. Military power perpetrating atrocities on civilian populations. And, as a fourth and sort of uniquely American concept that wrapped around this, the crime of conspiracy. That it is criminal for parties to agree and plan to perpetrate those first three: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of waging aggressive war. And all of that is codified here at London, and all of that is agreed by the four Allied powers on August 8th, 1945. That is London. It's not quite fair to say from there on Nuremberg is just a turnkey operation. Nuremberg is a huge complicated, human, fact-based adventure story. But Nuremberg doesn't happen without London. And Nuremberg happens in the framework of what London embodies. And that is law. That is law parachuting in to what otherwise is a devastated, lawless, inhumane landscape of war. Now, it wasn't all deep and serious and etc. And for the Cold War that's right around the corner, it's actually striking to see the human interactions, the humor, the camaraderie, and actual chemistry that exists among these people. They're sitting around a big square table, 5 people to each side, with translators, of course, because of the 3 different languages that are being employed. They're meeting in Church House, which is on the grounds of Westminster Abbey in London. It's the Church of England headquarters building. As you go out the back of Westminster and take a left into the yard, that away, Church House is the far front with pillars and sort of a stately plaque with Kofi Annan's signature rededicating the building in 1991, but without an explicit memorialization of what happened there. What happened there was huge. What happened there was maybe the last bright, beautiful moment of a world alliance. Good against evil, law against war, crime being defeated by law. And Jackson was Jackson. He was the guy who sprang from this soil, who was a regular guy, who was a horseback riding guy, who was a swimming Chautauqua Lake guy. He was a fun and normal, regular guy. It's captured a bit in this passage, which is the conclusion of their meeting early in the London process on July 4, 1945. Late that morning, after they've been arguing about all kinds of different topics, Jackson says, we should send this to the drafting committee. As far as a delegation is concerned, we are prepared to accept the suggestion and proceed in that way. I don't know whether further discussion is desired. And then he breaks. I shall ask to be excused in a minute because the 4th of July is a day on which we annually revive our historic hostility towards the British. But just for the noon hour, I want to go to the luncheon at the American colony in London. You see, General Nikitchenko, he says across the table to the lead Soviet representative, a show trial prosecutor of great note from the 1930s, we too are revolutionists. And some of the diaries and letters capture the fact that for the first time, Nikitchenko and his second, a fellow named Truman, a law professor, smiled, cracked up, thawed. And you can see Jackson just in that joke at the British expense, making the connection with the Soviets that makes possible this agreement. Jackson was doing this with an enormously long leash from Harry Truman. Harry Truman, a great president, was an unprepared rookie president dealing with huge, enormous things. And literally in this month of July, he's traveling to Potsdam, and he's meeting with Churchill and Stalin, and then Churchill loses the election, so Attlee shows up, and it is not enough space and time and brain power for Truman to take on this too. What Truman does is gives to Jackson carte blanche to represent the United States. And think of that for a moment, what that kind of discretion and power was about. This is a negotiation about world law, about the dealing with the senior captured Nazi leaders by the Allies. That isn't a presidential decision. It's for Jackson to handle, with Truman's consent and blessing and approval and gratitude. Jackson goes to Potsdam, actually in this age of very primitive air travel. It's amazing how many death-defying flights Justice Jackson, his son Bill Jackson, etc. took, crossing the Atlantic with all the refueling hopscotch of Gander and Stevensville and so forth, and everybody wearing their May vest life jacket and all kinds of engine blowouts and flamings and doors blowing off and this and that. Jackson pretty quickly, wherever possible, ordered Bill not to fly with him because he said, you know, as best we can, we should minimize the number of widows in one family. His daughter-in-law Nancy, his wife Irene, living together at Hickory Hill, didn't need to lose both of them if he could avoid it. And in that flying around, Jackson's going to Europe and meeting with Eisenhower and meeting with Marshall and meeting with Patton and meeting with Betts and meeting with Clay. And he's inspecting different sites in Berlin and Frankfurt and ultimately Nuremberg. And he's meeting with the counterparts. And it is an unbelievable summer job. You think of the Supreme Court in recess and what justices do with their summers. This was different. This was one of a category. At the end of the first round, in June of 45, Jackson writes a report to Truman. And it's a document that Truman immediately ratifies and releases publicly as U.S. policy. And it might be Robert Jackson's best opinion of that 44 term. This is Jackson writing to Truman in June of 1945. I'll read you just a couple of passages which capture some very important substance and some very authentic Jackson personality. The time, I think, has come when it is appropriate to outline the basic features of the plan of prosecution on which we are tentatively proceeding in preparing the case. The American case is being prepared on the assumption that an inescapable responsibility rests upon this country to conduct an inquiry, preferably in association with others, but alone if necessary, into the culpability of those whom there is probable cause to accuse of atrocities and other crimes. We have such men in our possession. What shall we do with them? And then he itemizes, let them go, shoot them now, or bring law to the situation. And then he enunciates two core principles that defined everything that followed. The defense should not be recognized. It is obsolete doctrine that a head of state is immune from legal liability. There is more than a suspicion that this idea is a relic of the divine right of kings. In other words, being the sovereign, being the head of state, isn't a free pass. Similarly, he says, with the doctrine of immunity of the head of state is usually coupled another, that orders from an official superior protect one who obeys them. It will be noticed that the combination of these two doctrines means that nobody is responsible. I was the head of state, I get a free pass. I was just following orders, I get a free pass. Jackson says both sides of this need to be refuted and broken and rejected. And when you read the London Agreement, you'll see that that's the core commitment from which Nuremberg proceeds. In other words, the law that parachutes in is universal law. It's head of state law. It is subordinate law. Following orders, if you're the guy on a firing squad line who's ordered to fire, is one thing. But if you are ordered to solve the Jewish question, that's something that requires discretion and decision-making and can never be permissible when you say, this is what they wanted me to do. That's what Nuremberg did, and that's what London really negotiated and established among the Allies. There are many more things to tell you, but I've already gone on too long. The anniversary of the London Agreement is August 8, 1945. You'll note how that overlaps with VJ Day, how it is bracketed by the dropping of the atomic bombs. The London Agreement, for all it did, and then they immediately went to work on the trial project, somewhat disappeared, even in its own time, and certainly in the decades since then. We correctly celebrate Nuremberg. Nuremberg was great. It was enormous. It was truly law parachuting in and happening. But a jump master needs to throw somebody off the plane before you have parachutists land in Nuremberg to do that. And so as we go forward into this summer, I hope we will see people noting this anniversary. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about it, and particularly delighted to give you tonight's reading assignment, because something great happened 60 years ago, and that's part of what the Jackson Society and the Jackson Center stands for. Thank you all very much.
You are listening to Justice, History, and the Law, lectures and interviews from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York.
The fact that we have the ability to have Father Moritz Fuchs here today is a little serendipitous, as been in many senses this project. First time I ever even knew there was a guy named Moritz Fuchs was in a book by Joseph Persico called Nuremberg, and they make references to a bodyguard of Robert H. Jackson. And I said, boy, isn't that interesting? And there are other citations throughout the book to Moritz Fuchs, then known as Sergeant Moritz Fuchs. And my curiosity was getting the best of me, so I then started to inquire as to whether or not Sergeant Fuchs was still alive. One of the benefits of being in the year 2002 is I know a little bit more about how to use the internet. If you're searching for people, one of the things you can do is go to google.com or others and type in a name and just guess what state it happens to be. So I typed in Moritz Fuchs, New York, just a guess. Start there. And woof, voila. Father Moritz Fuchs, Fulton, New York. I said, this good start. And there's a phone number. Now I'm going to tell this story, and hopefully he will not be mad. But I called, again, not being too shy. There's the number. Somebody answered on the end of the phone, and it starts off like this. Good afternoon. God bless. This is Father Fuchs. I said, this is Greg Peterson from Jamestown, New York. Yes, son. How can I help you? I said, well, I am the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center. And all of a sudden, his voice changed 180. You are Robert Jackson. That's terrific. I said, do you happen to have a few minutes that I'd like to talk to you with all, but my ultimate goal is to try to invite you to Jamestown to share your experience at the Robert Jackson Center. Well, I must tell you, I've been invited to attend the Hibernia Society meeting, and I must leave within 5 minutes. I said, I will not take your time. We'll call back later, but could you just tell me kind of how you got there in 5 minutes or less? And 30 minutes later, he was still rolling, and I was thrilled with the enthusiasm and the passion that Father Fuchs had displayed on the phone, and I now felt pretty guilty about the folks at the Hibernia Society who were no doubt waiting for him to show up. Well, I thought we'd call it quits, and I said, I feel sorry, Father, that you've kind of being late for the Hibernia Society. He goes, that was no big deal. They can wait. So I knew he was our kind of guy. We had a chance to visit with him. One of the attorneys in my office, John Tabor, and I couldn't wait, so we jumped in a car one day and drove out to meet him, and he was just very gracious, and you'll get to see that warmth later today. So part of the serendipity that Father Fuchs is here today, we can thank the internet, Joseph Persico, and it's just wonderful, and we thank you for coming. And there's nobody, dead or alive, who would have had a more unique experience and personal relationship with Robert H. Jackson than our guest, and I'm pleased to welcome Father Moritz Fuchs.
Another man of a similar quality of Robert H. Jackson was Jim Farley. At that time, he was Postmaster General of the United States. And he impressed me by addressing 4 or 5 of us soldiers by asking us where we came from. And each of us, as we gave the name of a city, he knew the postmaster of each one. I was awed by that. He was a similar quality as Justice Jackson. I really feel on the spot here, quite out of my element, like a fish out of water. At that time, I was more of a fly on the wall, knowing what was going on or seeing what's going on. But I was just 20 years old and didn't have much experience. The whole expectation that you have, I hope will not be disappointed, because I'm not a lawyer. I don't know much about law, but I got reaffirmed in what our country stood for and what we were trying to be. I'll go through a brief history of where I came from. Before World War II, I was an engineering student at Purdue, drafted at age 18, just after the second semester there. Entered Camp Upton on Long Island with a buddy of mine. We quickly got separated, though we both chose to go in the Army Specialized Training Program. That was not necessarily a good choice. We went to Fort Benning, Georgia, and as soon as we finished basic training, they dumped us all into the infantry. Unknown to us, of course, they were already planning for the June 6th D-Day invasion. Wanted us to be part of it. I was at the 87th Division in training at Camp Livingston, Louisiana. Then we shipped out to Fort Meade in October of '44, and from the New Jersey docks, some 5,000 of us boarded the Queen Elizabeth for a 7-day trip over the Atlantic. It was a zigzag trip over the water, trying to avoid submarines, of course. We slept in 3 8-hour shifts. You didn't have any place you called your own. And I remember a display shot from a cannon at one point shot off the aft deck. A 50-gallon barrel was dropped overboard, and when it was at a great distance, you could hardly see it. From the rolling decks, a shot was fired, and we could visually see the shot go out over the sea and hit that target. They told us that the accuracy of the cannon aim was possible because of gyroscopes. We landed in Scotland and saw some really welcome green land after that week of travel, and were sent overnight by train to Portsmouth over the English Channel to go to Omaha Beach as replacements in the 1st Division under General Omar Bradley. And if I remember correctly, we disembarked then by climbing down rope nets into landing craft. We were soon involved in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, where I was wounded on the 19th of November of '44. And it was mentioned in that little introduction, our whole squad was wiped out that day. I remember Whitey Swarhout got shrapnel right through his helmet. He was with the 1st Division all the way from Africa, and he was all set for a 30-day leave soon. But he got killed that day. First man I saw get killed. Shrapnel from 88th, as it was explained there already, rained deadly steel all across the forest floor. Having been wounded, I was evacuated through Cherbourg to England and spent 3 months at an army hospital at Blandford in England. So I missed the Battle of the Bulge. Some commentaries may include me in that, but I was not. I was comfortable in a hospital. I learned a few German words from Army phrase books, so I was able to claim ability to interrogate prisoners when I got back. And so I was called back to battalion headquarters, put on a bazooka, kind of a SWAT team, and I guess that language saved my life because it got me off the front line for a while. At Düren on the Rohr River, I remember a dead German teen soldier in a kneeling position, bandaged and frozen to death in the vestibule of a small church. We crossed the Rhine at Remagen and crossed over to the Harz Mountains to engage again there. President Roosevelt died at that time in April of '45. Soon after, we were transferred to Patton's Third Army, and we ended up the war in Czechoslovakia to end the war there in May. Our battalion commander, Lieutenant John T. Corley, was with a jeep driver. It took 2 of us west to Konnersreuth in Germany to visit Teresa, a stigmatic of whom he had heard. A stigmatic is one who bears the wounds of our Lord. Our 3rd Battalion, 26th Infantry of the 1st Division, the big red one, were then moved from Czechoslovakia to Ansbach in Germany, south of Nuremberg. Sometime in that July, I was appointed by Colonel Corley to protect the Honorable Robert H. Jackson, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, who had been named by President Truman, to be the chief prosecutor at the trials. Early in the trials, I kept my 1st Division and 26th Infantry insignia and was provided with a .45 caliber pistol. After the trials were underway a bit, I was to wear a generic plain Army uniform and was provided with a .38 snub-nosed pistol in a shoulder holster and an extendable blackjack. That was 57 years ago, and I was only 20, merely a spectator, but I had a really good seat to observe the proceedings of the International Military Tribunal. From the summer of '45 to August '46, I was on duty with Mr. Jackson 24/7. Whenever he was in court, I was in court. Wherever he was, I was close by. Mr. Jackson was provided a comfortable small estate at 31 Lindenstrasse in Fürth-Dambach, a few miles northwest of Nuremberg. The property had a tennis court, was well landscaped for privacy. An MP sentry was posted at the road entrance at all times. Some smaller building provided quarters for the 2 drivers and 3 cooks, and they took turns in their roles. A Mrs. Hassler had a schedule to come and supervise housekeepers. There was never any Mr. Hassler around. So the movie and a couple of excerpts you saw there distorted quite a few of the facts of the situation. I hope you keep that in mind when you see that movie. Hollywood license is quite extensive. So don't believe everything you see in the movies. I did not come from Brooklyn, but from Fulton, New York. Jackson never had to ride in a Jeep. I was never a driver because at that time I didn't know how to drive. And the Army trusted so much that they only made me a PFC when the war was over. But I became a staff sergeant on duty at Nuremberg. The television movie suggestion of romance between Jackson and Secretary Mrs. Douglas are totally without foundation. That's fully Hollywood stuff. And I knew them day by day for a whole year. I know there's none of that stuff going on. Mr. Jackson was provided with the use of a Mercedes touring car, 16-cylinder gas guzzler that had 75-gallon tank capacity and got about 3 miles to a gallon. It was only one of 5 that were made like that. It belonged to von Ribbentrop. 3 of them were armored. This was not an armored version. But the dashboard looked like an airplane cockpit. A supercharger kicked in at 40 miles an hour. It was quite a novelty when all the other cars were standard shift at that time. Hubcaps screwed on and held the wheels. At one time we had it up to 120 miles an hour. That's 200 kilometers on the Autobahn. Once on the Autobahn we had a flat, and the inner tube had simply disintegrated. Hardly a piece of the tube was left larger than a thumbnail. Leather upholstered, the car had jump seats, enabling 7 persons to sit in the back part. As the touring car, the top folded back too. The house at Firth Dombach had 2 floors, several rooms upstairs where Jackson and Douglas lived and had offices to work in, and where a considerable number of VIP guests came at different times to consult and plan strategies. Steps from the driveway led up to a small porch enclosure. I had a single small room immediately to the right of the entrance with full view of the sentry post and the front door, so I acted as greeter to all the guests. Screener, if you will. Some pictures out there show how staff and guests at a Christmas party held in December 45. The pictures give evidence of some good camaraderie the staff had. Knowing that I could have mustered out of the Army, Mr. Jackson was kind enough to send a note home at Christmas to my mother. Nearer the end of the trial, he recommended me for the Army Commendation Medal for having served him well. A smaller car was also available, shown in one of those pictures. Some weekends we used that in our travels. I remember one of the things that impressed me, especially as a non-driver, how it had a self-returning steering wheel, which is still a novelty at that time. Once we visited Rothenburg, a quaint medieval walled city west of Nuremberg. Another time, arrangements were made for several of the staff with Mr. Jackson and son, Naval Lieutenant William Jackson, to go hunting. I was the only one to shoot a deer, which Mr. Jackson himself later dressed. He and others were assured and comforted to see that his personal bodyguard was a good marksman. Other short trips included Dachau, Berchtesgaden, Oberammergau, and Innsbruck. There surely were many other excursions, but those stand out in my memory now at age 76, 57 years later. The time sequence of some events has faded in my memory. A lot of things have. But I know that I accompanied Mr. Jackson and the staff to London and Berlin on business, later to Nice and Rome, where he went to be at the consistory when Pius XII elevated Cardinal Spellman as Archbishop of New York. One short flight to Paris at one point went without me as I had the flu. The courtroom at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg was fairly well represented in the television movie, except that all 8 judges sat all the time, both the judges and their alternates. The courtroom was well modernized and the layout well planned. They really made a different courtroom out of it from what it was. The translation system that was being worked out at the fledgling United Nations organization meetings at San Francisco at that time was adapted to allow all in the courtroom to listen not only to verbatim dialogue, but also by earphones to any of the 4 major languages being spoken, English, German, French, or Russian, as the dialogue was translated simultaneously from the 12 translators boxed off in a corner of the courtroom. The light at the podium lit if the presenter spoke too rapidly. There's none of those here. I hope I'm not going too fast. The defendants were enabled to choose their own lawyers, even among the Nazis, to represent them, anyone they could find. They were also offered any advantage for their defense that any court or tribunal of any of the 4 chief countries would allow to their own citizens. Their accumulation of documents is what condemned them. The departure, the trip home, was in August of 46. Mr. Jackson wanted to come back for some reason, and the total of the prosecution was complete. We flew via Gander, Newfoundland for refueling. All of us passengers in those days had to wear a parachute harness. We arrived at Washington. I remember passengers included Mr. Jackson, Mrs. Douglas, Bill Jackson, Captain John Venettis, and Bob Vlasnik, a driver, and myself among the other staff. Bob Vlasnik and I had expressed our willingness to terminate at that time, and Jackson said we can come back home with us. Mr. Jackson invited Vlasnik and myself to stay at his home at that time it was at McLean, Virginia, until we went to the Army Separation Center at Fort Dix. Later, that same estate at Hickory Hill at McLean, Virginia, became a Kennedy estate, or John or Robert Kennedy. After discharge, I arrived in Fulton, New York, August 15th, 46, entered St. Andrew's Seminary a few weeks later. It was a good move. Mr. Jackson and some smaller staff returned to Nuremberg for the sentencing that fall. It may have been in 1953, during my years of study at Theological College, Catholic University in America, that I visited with Mr. Jackson in the Supreme Court chambers. Then he died in October of 54, unexpectedly. Mrs. Elsie Douglas honored me greatly by having come to Syracuse Cathedral in May 1955 for my ordination and for my first Mass in Fulton. I haven't written any books on this kind of stuff because there's been abundant documentation on the major trial. Books, I know, are better than the movie, believe me. Nuremberg, Infamy on Trial by Joseph Persico, America's Advocate by Eugene Gerhardt, and 2 volumes on the prosecution by Herbert Wexler are well recommended. And if you really like to read, there are 42 volumes printed by the government printing office on the entire proceedings that fill 12 feet of bookshelf. Mr. Jackson was kind enough to give me a set, which I in turn donated a few years later when I saw I wasn't using them, to the Ali Brondi Thomas More Center at Syracuse University. They later gave the set to the University Law School, which now may even have 2 sets. Autographed first volume was graciously replaced by Mr. Jackson so I could keep it. I think that's out on the display table too. Magazine articles by Time and Memory by Joseph Persico in 1994, and an American Heritage magazine of July and August, and Judgment at Nuremberg by Robert Schneerson in the Smithsonian magazine, October 96, are a couple of good articles too. Robert Hewitt Jackson became for me a hero among national leaders. I found him to be an exemplar of knowledge and culture. He was sensitive to the dignity and value of human beings, and hence appropriately outraged at the abuses perpetrated by the Nazis against other humans. He deserved my deepest respect and high esteem, since he was so articulate in perceiving and expressing in precise and legal terms the abhorrence we all sensed after learning of so many horrors from the Nazis' own records. I liked the man very much and hold him in highest esteem. He knew himself to be human, but with his background of faith and learning, admirable character, he is one who deserves high honor as a statesman who did his part well and is worthy of admiration and pride of our whole nation. Thank you for listening.
The Jackson Center is a historical and educational facility dedicated to preserving the legacy of this country lawyer who became Solicitor General, Attorney General, a Justice of the Supreme Court, and served as Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg Trials of Nazi war criminals following World War II. To learn more about this program, Robert Jackson, the Jackson Center, and upcoming events, the Jackson Center is located at 305 East 4th Street, Jamestown, New York, and found on the web at www.roberthjackson.org or contacted by telephoning 716-483-6646.